Good evening, everyone, and welcome, very warm welcome to this event, which, as Julie says, is organised jointly by the Frontline Club and the BBC College of Journalism. My name is Vin Ray, and tonight's session is the latest in a series in which we talk to some of our most established journalists about their careers, their work, and their influences, and in doing so, in some way, we hope, to further the debate about the craft and practice of journalism. Those of you who've been here before, and there's a few of you I can see, will know the form. There's some discussion. We've got a first this evening. We're going to have some readings, some TV pieces, a bit of radio, and then at the end, some Q&A. It's a very strange compilation of This Is Your Life, Desert Island Discs, all in the cosy surrounds of the Frontline Club. Our guest this evening is one of Britain's most distinguished foreign correspondents. She is currently the international editor of Channel 4 News, but she's also worked for the BBC and also, interestingly, I think, worked for a number of aid agencies as well. She has reported extensively from Africa, from the Middle East, more recently China, but even as I say that, I know, as you'll discover, there are very few places of any import from which she has not reported. We often say someone is award-winning because they have picked up a gong somewhere along the way. But if I read out all the awards that this person has won, there would be no time left for discussion at the end of it. She is, of course, and please welcome Lindsey Hilsum. So, Lindsey, foreign affairs is populated by very much by sort of alpha males, and I was delighted when I received Lindsey's note about some of the things she'd done in her career. It began with these words: uneventful childhood, unimaginative grammar school, undistinguished university career. This is not the kind of modesty you normally get from foreign correspondents. Something must have gone right there.
Yeah, but it went right after that, you see. That bit sort of doesn't, you know, it was fine. Then life began. So,
which came first? You travelled a tremendous amount when you were at university, but was there an itch for travel or an itch for journalism?
There was an itch for travel. I didn't really care much what I did, provided I did it somewhere exciting.
Where did you do it and how did you do it?
Well, what I did was I was studying languages at university, Spanish and French, and I was supposed to, in my third year, go to Spain or France to teach English, which I thought sounded really dull. So I said I wanted to go to Latin America, and so I wrote to anybody I could think of who worked in Latin America, which was travel companies or anything. And one day I got a letter from Oxfam saying, our secretary has fallen pregnant in the Guatemala office for the second time. These were the days when Oxfam wasn't as professional as it is now. Is there any way you could come and help? And they said, can you type and can you do accounting? So I wrote back and said, yes, absolutely. And then I went out and bought Teach Yourself Typing and Teach Yourself Accounting. These are skills which I've never actually completely mastered. Typing I can just about do. Accounting I haven't got a clue. And then I worked as a waitress until I got the fare to go, and I went to Guatemala. And when I got to Guatemala, they immediately discovered that I was absolutely useless at the tasks which they set me, which were basically sort of secretarial and administrative. But the things which they thought were difficult, I thought were quite easy and much more interesting, which was going to villages and talking to people and finding out about projects and writing reports and, getting up in front of villagers and making speeches about all sorts of nonsense. And all that stuff which they thought was very difficult, I thought was just fun. So that was how it
So was it just in Guatemala? Or were you...
I was in Guatemala, El Salvador, Mexico, and then I went to Haiti and the Dominican Republic. And I remember very clearly waking up when I was living in Guatemala. I was 20 at the time. Waking up one morning and I had this beautiful room looking out. It was very blue sky and red adobe walls, and thinking, I think I'm going to do this for the rest of my life. And in a funny way, I think I have done.
You have done. Yeah. So did you ever finish your degree?
Yes, I went back and I finished my undistinguished degree. And then I graduated in 1980, which was a bit like now, when there are no jobs, and I had, a series of kind of fairly hopeless jobs. And then I went back out to Mexico, and by then I decided I should try to be a journalist.
And why did you want to become a journalist?
Because I had no skills. All I could do, all I could do was read, write, and ask questions in 3 languages. That was it. And so I thought, well, who would pay me to do that? And so that was what I did.
So who first paid you to do it?
Who first paid me to do it? Caribbean Contact, the monthly magazine of the Caribbean Council of Churches, Latin American newsletters, all sorts of obscure things, and quite a lot of people who didn't pay me as well, of course. And this is, when you kind of remember that the people who are really good to you when you're young. I had the contact of Alan Riding, who was the New York Times correspondent in Mexico, and I went into his office and said, I'm Lindsey and I want to be a journalist, what shall I do? And he said, okay, do this. He said, go to the Mexican border, do a story about the young women who work in the maquiladoras, the factories there, who are non-unionized and they have no rights, and it was a free trade zone. And he said, and then call this man, and you can go up on a helicopter with La Migra, which were the border police, and do a story about Mexicans going across the border into the US. So I got on the bus and I went off and I did exactly that. And that story about the maquiladoras, the young women in the factory, I had been to see The Guardian before I left, and they had a thing in those days called the Third World page. And I sent it to them. I mean, I did my story, I typed it out, I cut it with all the bits that were wrong and put sellotape to make it in the right order. And I put it in an envelope and put a stamp on it and posted it from Mexico City to London. And about 2 months later, my father rang me. I was living in the Dominican Republic by then, and said, it was sort of a tale of puzzlement. He said, you've got a story in The Guardian. I said, have I? And he said, it's much longer than the other story in the same page.
So that was a bad thing. Okay, do you want to introduce your first?
Right, my
piece?
first thing, I mean, when they first asked me to do this, it was all about broadcast, and then I had to admit that I never actually watched very much television, and all I did was read. And certainly in the years I lived in Latin America, I had no television, and actually in the years later on when I lived in Africa, I didn't have one either. Oh, I haven't got it. Where is it? It's here. But, so the first piece I'm going to read is by Martha Gellhorn. Martha Gellhorn was a great American journalist and who achieved fame, first of all, in the Spanish Civil War. And she became famous because of her relationship with Ernest Hemingway. But actually, she was a much better writer than he was. And she got it in a way that he never did because he was too pissed most of the time. And so this is from an excerpt from a piece called High Explosive for Everyone, written in 1937 for Collier magazine in Madrid. And she's describing a scene in the Spanish Civil War. Women are standing in line, as they do all over Madrid, quiet women, dressed usually in black, with market baskets on their arms, waiting to buy food. A shell falls across the square. They turn their heads to look and move a little closer to the house, but no one leaves her place in line. After all, they've been waiting there for 3 hours, and the children expect food at home. In the Plaza Mayor, the shoeblacks stand around the edges of the square with their little boxes of creams and brushes, and passers-by stop and have their shoes polished as they read a paper or gossip together. When the shells fall too heavily, the shoeblacks pick up their boxes and retreat a little way into a side street. So now the square is empty. The people are leaning close against the houses around it, and the shells are falling so fast that there is almost no time between them to hear them coming, only the steady roaring as they land on the granite cobblestones. Then for a moment it stops. An old woman with a shawl over her shoulders, holding a terrified thin little boy by the hand, runs out into the square. You know what she is thinking. She is thinking she must get the child home. You are always safer in your own place with the things you know. Somehow you do not believe you can get killed when you're sitting in your own parlour. You never think that. She is in the middle of the square when the next one comes. A small piece of twisted steel, hot and very sharp, sprays off from the shell. it takes the little boy in the throat. The old woman stands there, holding the hand of the dead child, looking at him stupidly, not saying anything, and men run out toward her to carry the child. At their left, at the side of the square, is a huge, brilliant sign which says, "Get out of Madrid." I think that that is the most amazing piece of observational journalism, which it's just that juxtaposition of the ordinariness of it all, of women queuing for bread and the kids are there and all the things that are on their mind, and it's in the middle of a war. And I just think it's the most remarkable evocation of what it's like. And I remember reading Martha Gellhorn in those early days and thinking, my God, you know, because when I was in Central America, it was the early days of the wars in Central America, just thinking, my God, this woman's descriptions, her evocations are extraordinary.
Is that easier to do in print than in television?
Well, it's different, isn't it? Because in television you don't describe anything because the pictures show you. So you don't need to describe anything. And if you do describe anything, you're doing it wrong. So it is a huge difference in the craft. And when you move from print to television, it's one of the things that you learn. Your producer tears out vast amounts of your verbiage. Because on television it doesn't work. You need to really boil it down, and the pictures do the work that the description does there. But somehow I still feel that when you read something like that, it gives you something that television doesn't give you.
Very moving, yeah. I know she hated being Ernest Hemingway's, thought of as Ernest Hemingway's wife, but I read somewhere that she said that journalistic objectivity was a nonsense, and that she was, some people thought that she used her journalism to further her political views. I mean, what do you, is journalistic objectivity a nonsense?
No, I don't think so. I mean, she was definitely very left-wing, and James Cameron, who we'll also quote later, was very left-wing. But I mean, it's a very fraught issue, but I don't like journalism that tries to prove a point. I like, part of the point, one of the things I have learned is that you go out there with an idea and thinking that you know how it's going to be, but it's often not. And if you're a good journalist, then you have to put up with your worldview being assaulted the whole time. And I hate journalism, whether it's from the left or the right, and I don't think Martha Gellhorn was guilty of this, which is selective and just takes the things which support the point of view. Should I say who I'm talking about or not? John Pilger. Can't stand it. Goes out, all those people, or Mark Stein from the right, have an idea, have a point to prove, goes out, find the facts to, paint by bloody numbers. I can't stand it.
Okay, we reached 1982, and you went to work for UNICEF. Why was that? Tell us about it.
I got a job. Basically, I was in the Caribbean. I was in the Dominican Republic and Haiti. I had no money, had no job. And somebody said, oh, why don't you apply to UNICEF to be a volunteer? And so I did, and the job that came up was in Nairobi. So I went to Nairobi and to work as a volunteer information officer for UNICEF in Eastern and Southern Africa for 3 years, which is what I did.
Now, you then started moonlighting, as far as I can tell, covertly under a pseudonym doing journalism before running away to Uganda. I think is that right? Well,
there are only so many pieces about ventilated pit latrines that you can write. And, I'm very, very much in favour of mother-child healthcare programmes, but, God, it was dull. And so I did start to, find out about other things, and also because in UNICEF they always want to squeeze the politics out, which is the most interesting thing. So I wrote under a pseudonym for a while, and then...
What was your pseudonym?
Reba Linden.
Reba.
I was taken from a book, Song of Solomon by Toni Morrison. And then there was the war in Uganda, and when Museveni and his rebel army got to Kampala, I was just desperate to get there. And But what I found was, and this was quite good, there was a radio in the UN office in Nairobi, where all the UN people were passing the security messages. And so it was a Saturday, and I thought, oh, I know. So I sat in the radio room, and I got all the information about what was happening all over Kampala, and I filed it to the Observer, which was my first front page story, which I did under my own name because I couldn't bear it by then to not be under my own name. And then the next day I did go to the airport. I thought, I have to go to Uganda, and it's the only time in my life when there's actually been a tannoy saying, will Lindsey Hilsum please come back, which was UNICEF. But luckily, they realized then that this had spun out of control, and they then sent me to Uganda to work with a panorama team, because one of the big issues in the war in Uganda was the use of child soldiers, because so many children had been orphaned in the war and been picked up by the rebel army. So then I had an extraordinary trip up the eastern front of the war with Museveni, sitting around the campfire with the man who is still now president of Uganda, and with Panorama, and with Mike Wooldridge, who was the BBC correspondent. And that was amazing, and that was really good. And then shortly afterwards, I left UNICEF, which had to happen, to go freelance as a journalist. And I was very lucky, because very quickly I got the Guardian string. The Guardian stringer gave up. And
in Nairobi.
In Nairobi, and Mike Wooldridge, and then the BBC stringer, the number 2. Basically, it was too old and decrepit by then, and so they offered me. Well, it wasn't they offered me the job. It wasn't a job, but you know, it was a chair and a table, yeah. And so I could start.
Okay, do you want to take us through your next?
What is the next
choice?
one?
It's Kate.
Oh yes, Kate Adie. Actually, now Kate Adie is often not respected in the industry. A lot of people in the industry sort of think that she was overrated and so on. But as a girl in the 70s, and I mean, in the 70s and 80s, she was it. She was the most famous foreign correspondent. And she spoke directly to people. Audiences loved her. They still love her. People still say, they say to me now, are you the next Kate Adie? No, I say, I'm not. I'm me. But there was a way that she reached people, which I think we could all look at and try and work out what it is. So, and this is from her when she was in Libya. This was a story when the American bombing of Libya via British bases, for which she got into most incredible shit with the Tory government at the time.
Within sight of our seafront hotel, a series of flashes and a low rumbling indicated that the intended targets were well within the city. After a short while, the Libyan defences went into action. Red tracer bullets, anti-aircraft fire. The sky filled with an evil firework display. For the rest of the night, there was confusion as the electricity supply was cut off and foreign journalists were confined to the hotels. Then, as dawn broke, we were taken by officials to a residential district in the center of the city. At least half a dozen bombs had been dropped in this area, flattening one apartment block next to the French embassy and severely damaging the embassy.
4 hours after the raid, the Libyans still have no idea how many people were injured here. This is at least 2 miles from the barracks. There are still people possibly buried under this rubble. The confusion is considerable.
The Americans' intended target was possibly the Central Security Headquarters. They missed. Instead, a medical clinic and ordinary flats and houses took the hit. The number of casualties is not at all clear.
5 civilians, in which they were living in 2 buildings. And presumably they're gone, but we're just a chance.
Are they your family?
That there might be, yes. She's my aunt, and they're very close relatives.
What happened to their house?
Just left.
Most people had been asleep, and some could not recall what had happened. They were in a state of shock. Others had clear impressions.
Well, the first thing I saw when I woke up, just a big circle of fire in front, and I think, I thought it's going to be on my head.
Several people have died. One elderly man's body was surrounded by angry youths, many of them chanting Istishhad, martyrdom.
Okay. What I was saying to Lindsey just before we came up, actually, that when we started the BBC College of Journalism, we did a survey of all the journalists in the BBC, and one of the questions we asked was who most inspired you to become a journalist, and Kate Adie won by a country mile. And I just wondered, I mean, there's lots of myths about Kate, and she even created the thing about I stopped the cameraman to put my earrings on before we did the piece to camera in that piece. But you said that we need to learn, there are things that we can learn from it. What I mean, in a craft and journalistic sense, what can we learn?
What I liked, they missed. You know, there's a sort of directness about the way she looks at things. You know, it's quite sort of clear. And I think that there's something in her delivery which is extremely clear and extremely, you know, there's no messing around and making excuses. You feel this is somebody who is telling you quite simply what happened. And there's something about her style which just works and communicates to me. And for me, it must be, I think it must be the simplicity of it. It works.
Yeah. But most, my impression anyway, and this is not my impression, it's true, that most foreign correspondents are male. Why is that?
Well, what do you know? Maybe because most of the people who appoint foreign correspondents are male. Could be.
Yep.
I can't think of another reason.
What would you advise a woman starting out now who wants to be a foreign correspondent any differently from a man?
I would say that you will probably still encounter prejudice. You will still encounter the idea that somehow or other, for some reason lost in the mists of time, it's easier for a man. And you just have to get through it. But I don't think, I mean, to be perfectly honest, with the state of journalism today, it's probably pretty much equally difficult for both. But assumptions and prejudices are still there.
There's actually a very interesting...
most editors are still men.
Yeah. There's a very interesting thing happening in America where they can't seem to convince any young men to go into journalism schools at all. And there was a piece in the Washington Post about it that, and I taught an NYU class a couple of years ago. 45 people in the class, one male, and 44.
And why do you think
women.
that is?
And I don't know. I just don't know.
Well, maybe it's becoming a low-paid, caring profession.
It may well be.
You know, like it's like being a vicar. They can't get men to be vicars now either.
Yeah. You said in the note you sent me, Lindsey, that at some point political certainty began to wilt in the face of reality. What did you mean by that?
I meant Africa. That I became extremely left-wing in Latin America, as all people, or most people did at that point. And you know, el pueblo unido nunca será vencido. People united will never be defeated, and all that stuff. And then you get to Africa and you find out, actually, you know, it's not that simple. And actually, the causes of poverty and deprivation are extremely complex and difficult to work out. And revolutions don't work, and revolutions eat their own children, and all that stuff. So that was, I mean, which also happened in Latin America, of course. But I was in Africa at that point in maturing, I guess.
Well, just say a bit about that in terms of certainly broadcast journalism, which doesn't deal with complexity very well. How do you get around something where, you know, we all want simplicity, we all want a simple message, but the reality is it's just not simple?
Well, I mean, one of the things which is good about working on Channel 4 News is that we have slightly longer, and so we can do a little bit more of that. But a really good television piece, in my view, should work on more than one level. And that is it should work on the level of telling you what happened. But there should also be stuff in there which explains why and gives you context, which is partly in the script, and it's partly in the things that people say, that your interviewees say. And so the ideal piece for me is doing both. It's both frontline and a certain amount of context analysis too. Now, I understand that for an ITV News or BBC 10 o'clock news, it's extremely hard. If you're 1 minute 40 or 2 minutes, whatever. In Channel 4 News, we can do a little bit more. And that's what I think is worthwhile.
Oh, okay. Your next piece.
What was my next piece?
I think it's me.
You read it. It's
yeah.
James Cameron. It's in some ways similar to the Martha Gellhorn, because it's description. But James Cameron, you know, who's a great journalist for The Guardian, though he did actually also later do BBC documentaries and so on. And he was the first Western journalist to be allowed into North Vietnam in 1965. And what I like about this piece is partly description, but also because he touches on some of the universalities which you come across in reporting from countries at war and poor countries and countries under communism. I think he puts his finger on a lot of things where the audience has been subjected to a lot of political propaganda, and then you go to a place where there's a lot of political propaganda on that side too, and you, as a reporter, a foreign correspondent, are trying to find your way through that maze, or as he puts it, through that looking glass.
Okay. This is from the Evening Standard on the 7th of December 1965 by James Cameron, and the headline is "Victory If It Takes Forever." This is Hanoi, which the Americans will say is full of demons and the communists will say is full of heroes. It seems to me, on the contrary, to be very full of people, largely indistinguishable from those of Saigon except in the bleak austerity of their condition. The important thing is that one is now through the looking glass and everything outside. You and home and London and New York, everything is a sort of mirror image where black is white and white is black, good is bad and bad is good. Defense is aggression. Military efficiency is wanton cruelty. Right is wrong. It is not the first time this has happened to me, but more strikingly now than ever. Once you turn all the political value judgments into terms of people, they become both simpler and more difficult. The communists have had it for 11 years. The old Hanoi has vanished. It had a wayward charm, and now it has an anguished efficiency. No more brilliant girls floating like butterflies in their gossamer audice. The black and white trousered uniform of the workers is everywhere. The shops have the battered, empty drabness of state stores everywhere. Well, these are hard times. Outside the ration, there never seems to be much to buy except an occasional plastic comb, an enamelled bowl, a second-hand spare part of an unidentifiable machine. The war hangs overhead like a brutal cloud. There is practically no private civilian motor traffic in the north. But what exists is like all military transport, heavily camouflaged under piles of branches, palm fronds, banana leaves. Even in the towns, this phenomenon continues. Cars and lorries buried in greenery. Burnham Wood, forever coming to Dunsinane.
I love that last line, the idea of...
I don't suppose the standard quote Shakespeare very much these days. But.
Yes, that's right, but I just love that idea, because I mean, we've all seen, you know, camouflaged vehicles, the idea that they're like Burnham Wood coming to Dunsinane. I think that's brilliant.
So what did you like about James Cameron?
Oh, I like, well, when I was looking through for a piece, most of what I liked was how funny he is, which he isn't in that piece, but he is very hilarious on the whole experience of being a journalist. But what I like about that is that idea of being through the looking glass, and that everything you come across being different, you know, the opposite of, contradictory to what you've been told to expect. And also the other idea I really like is the fact that it's full of people. They're not heroes, as the communists say. They're not devils, as the Americans say. They're people, and that's what we report on. And we report on how war or other events in life affect people. That's the most important thing.
There's a fantastic sort of buggeration factor about James Cameron. I was telling Lindsey, I discovered a piece in the BBC archives, a half-hour documentary, and it had 5 pieces to camera in this half-hour documentary, and he's smoking like a chain in every single one of them.
I love it.
Which is just kind of unthinkable.
Yes, it was often it. But I think the writing in both the Martha Gellhorn and James Cameron is interesting. It's so different from the writing you find in newspapers now. It's so much more descriptive and more evocative, I think. in some ways, I think maybe our newspaper writing has become more like television writing. It's much more spare than it used to be.
Okay, so 1986, you became the BBC stringer in Nairobi, and you worked a lot with Mike Waldridge, who's a lovely man. And you said at one point that he was your mentor, and I just wondered what you felt you learned from Mike.
Oh, everything. I mean, Mike was the BBC correspondent. He's a brilliant radio reporter. What I learned from him more than anything else is that being persistent will work better than being aggressive. And I would hear him on the telephone saying things like, so, Mr. Amin, i.e. Idi Amin, you say you have left Saudi Arabia. Now, where exactly did you say you were going to? I was just very polite and very nice, and just keeping him going and taking his notes and all the rest of it, and just being calm and keeping up and never giving up, and gradually getting to the hard questions. As you get to the hard questions, and by then the person is talking. So Mike's way with people was something that I learned a lot from. He never, ever lost his temper. I can't say I've learned that. Producer in the back knows that only too well, but we cannot say that I've learned that one. But I know that is the right way to be from Mike. And also Mike taught me about detail, and he taught me not to be afraid to say I in a radio piece, because I used to say we as if I didn't exist. He said, well, who's this we? He says, no, I saw this, I saw that. And he said, details, what did... So you told me earlier, because I'd come back and say, oh, I've been to such and such a place and I've seen this and this, and I do the story. He said, well, why don't you say what, you told me how the old lady looked. Why don't you say that in the radio piece? That was really interesting. So that attention to detail, which you, again, and this is a radio and print thing more than a TV thing, but it's trying to evoke things with detail. So you can do it in lives with TV.
And this was a time when you got beaten up, did you?
I did at one point get beaten up.
What happened then?
There were demonstrations at the university, and as a not very experienced journalist at the time, I went, okay, so the road is here, the police are here, the university is here, and I knew the area well because I had lived there, and so, like an idiot, I went under the fence to where the students were demonstrating because I wanted to interview them. And like an idiot, I stood just here where there was like an archway and the police were there. So in full view of the police, I got out my microphone and started interviewing people. What an idiot. And so then the police charged and started beating people, what they call rungus, which are like baseball bats. I had the sense not to run, because I thought if I run and they shoot people in the back, I'm just running. So what I did was I went down like this, and I turned on my tape recorder so I thought, record them beating up other people, but actually I ended up recording them beating me up because they beat me up quite badly. And then because it's Kenya, and there's quite complex relationships between black people and white people, and so as they sort of picked me up and the riot police took me out and I'm sort of bleeding all over, one of them turned to me and said, oh, sorry, madam. That was what it was like.
So, what did you learn about being a kind of white reporter from a Western news organization operating in Africa? Were there other things to avoid? Because there's been an awful lot of talk over the years about stereotypical reporting and so.
Yeah, I think one of the things I learned a lot. One of the things I learned was not to look at Africa through the aid agency glasses. The way the Western world tends to look at Africa is as recipients of aid. Aid is such a tiny part of what goes on in Africa. It's not even that interesting. But we often do that. And even if you are doing a story which involves aid, talk to the African aid workers. 99% of aid workers are Africans. Talk to them. They know a lot more. And that's not true just in Africa. That's everywhere. I remember being in Bangladesh in a cyclone. Everyone was talking to the Médecins Sans Frontières people whose English was appalling. I spoke to the Bangladeshi doctors whose English was perfect, who understood what was going on and had a wider context, understood very much more. So I think it's that, but I think it's also Africa has politics, complex politics. Talk to people about that. Don't just look at it from our perspective. And now, obviously, you have one of the stories which I've done and which has interested me a lot is Chinese investment in Africa. I mean, this is really interesting. This is changing the continent. It actually took people here, journalists here, a long time to even notice it was going on. Why did it take us so long to notice why it was going on? Because we're not looking at the right things. Because we're looking at ourselves in Africa, white people in Africa. White people in Africa are not that interesting.
Okay, so you stayed in the BBC for a while. You went back to Bush House, I think,
yes.
for a while. But Bush House had a very strict rotation policy, I seem to remember at the time. You were out in the field, then you had to go back and be.
Oh, but I wasn't staff in the field, so it didn't matter.
Right, so
I came back and got a staff job briefly.
Right. And then, for whatever reason, which you're going to go and explain, you resigned from the BBC, which I think is very interesting. I remember when Greg Dyke joined the BBC, he had this phrase which was, if you're unhappy, take control of your life.
Ah, yes.
And I thought this was a fantastic thing, actually, because one of the reasons he said it was he found people all over the BBC, they're incredibly lucky, but they were whinging all the time about their lot. But I think resigning from the BBC is still quite a big step for anybody who's interested in foreign news. So why did you do it?
I was a producer at the World Service, and I wanted to, and I had done okay in that I still behaved like a freelance, and I had managed to get quite a lot of overseas assignments, which I would do by going to the news department, because it was a bit disjointed then. I would go to news and say, Current Affairs has given me £500 to go and do this story in Bangladesh, which was a lie. And then I would go to Current Affairs and news would say, okay, we'll match that. So then I would go to Current Affairs and say, news has given me £500 to go to Bangladesh, so will you? And they say, okay, we've matched that. So I managed to, work the system and get out quite a lot and do quite a lot of good stuff. But I wanted to go and live overseas again. And I kept applying for jobs as super stringer or correspondent, and I never got them. And they nearly all went to men. And the one in particular, one moment of despair was I applied for one in Egypt, and it went to somebody who has sunk without trace, who will remain, whose name I can't even remember, actually. And I asked, not people interviewed, but my immediate boss at the time, why this person had got the job, not me. And he said, oh, well, he has an Egyptian wife, doesn't he? So I said, but I have no wife at all. Is that a problem? And at that point I thought, oh, God, this isn't going to work, is it? And then and then there was another job, which was in India, and I thought, okay, either I get this or I leave. And what I did was I told everybody that, because then I knew that I would have to do it, because I couldn't live with myself if I'd said I was going to do it and not. Anyway, sure enough, I didn't get the job. And so, damn it, I then had to leave. So I did.
So did you then freelance again?
I then freelanced, and I have to say, lots of people in the BBC were lovely to me, because, of course, I was in a hopeless situation. But you see, these were the days of news information, when you had, a library of clippings, and they were my best friends. And I would put together a trip going somewhere to do a story, which would always be like a sideline on a major story where they weren't sending out correspondents. And there was no Google, there was no internet, there was nothing. But NewsInf would always slip me in and let me go and sit there and photocopy stuff for them. And my friends on NewsHour would let me sit and use the telephone. So I still was able to use BBC resources entirely through the back door. And then I would go and do a trip where I would do features. I would work for Woman's Hour, or I'd do something for the Today programme. I'd then do a bit for The Guardian, this and that. But it was hard, and it was lonely, and it wasn't very lucrative. And I can remember a week in Jordan where I spent most of the time crying in my hotel room because I was lonely, and because I didn't have any money, and because I wasn't a real journalist, and it was all my own fault. You have to go through those phases, don't you?
I don't know.
Well, you do. But let me just say one thing about the end of that, which was, it was when you had the Yitzhak Rabin, Yasser Arafat handshake on the lawn of the White House. And I wandered out that day. I hadn't got any commissions. I didn't know what I was doing. And I bumped into this young Palestinian woman in a refugee camp. And she said, oh, why don't you come and watch it on television with us in the evening with me and my mother and my grandmother? I thought, oh, that's a great story. 3 generations of Palestinian women watching this thing. And the grandmother, who was the father's mother, had to leave in 48, and the mother had left in 67. And the young woman was incredibly radical, and she'd been born in exile. And we sat and watched this, and they were like people anywhere in the world watching the television. I was expecting all this kind of political explosion, and they were going, what the hell is Hillary Clinton wearing? Call that a hat? you know, and so on. And it was wonderful. And then I did do it as a story. I don't think anybody ever used it. But hey, you know, it was a great experience.
Okay, should we look at your next piece?
The next piece, this is Charles Wheeler, the great Charles Wheeler. I've tried to avoid in my choices men from the BBC because of my own prejudices. But there's one who you have to have, and I know Alan Littlehead as well. This is Charles Wheeler, who is the greatest foreign correspondent because of his compassion and just his feeling and the way he let people speak. And this is with the Kurds as they were being pushed out of Kurdistan during the first Iraq War. And I should say that the producer was my current editor, Jim Gray.
Doctors have told us that this difference in altitude is crucial to a child's chance of survival.
Every day.
These men told us that up here many babies are dying every day of exposure and hunger.
We die for cold and for no food, milk, no milk.
Yeah.
We are heavy baby. My baby is killed, died after 2 days.
You have a baby?
Yes.
Your baby died?
Yes.
Your baby died?
Hey.
My baby,
Yes. My brother too. Died.
This man says he's lost 2 of his children, a 13-year-old and a 2-year-old.
2 weeks by no car.
2 weeks?
By going, yes.
Walking?
Walking, yes.
From
no
Abu?
car.
2 weeks?
Yes.
Yeah.
And no car by walking. Food, no food in
to eat, and no rest, any help, nothing.
Nothing?
Nothing, any help.
You spend 5 or 10 minutes in this weather, and no matter how many clothes you're wearing, you're soaked and you're wet and you're miserable. And these people have been here 2 weeks. 2 weeks since they left these Kurdish towns. The road is closed, the town is full, the Iranian authorities can't cope. There's a big green plain here. This is a valley, a high valley. It should be possible to drop tents, to drop food from aircraft. It wouldn't be too difficult. It doesn't rain all the time. There aren't high winds all the time. What these people cannot understand is why they're still sitting here and why so little aid is coming from outside.
And that piece, so the 2 pieces which Charles did for Newsnight had a tremendous impact. It was sort of the morning after that John Major, British Prime Minister at the time, decided that there should be safe havens, and that policy started, and Jeffrey Archer started a huge campaign for raising money, probably the only good thing Jeffrey Archer ever did in his life. And that was because of Charles's reporting, which I just think that his empathy with people is exceptional without being saccharine, and his description of just standing there in the rain and you can just see it. And maybe part of it comes from his persona and the fact that he was quite elderly at the time. I don't know, but I just think that the way he did it was brilliant.
Is that just talk a bit about emotive reporting?
Yes.
And the issue of empathy, which is crucial. But how do you get the balance right?
I think that the thing about emotion is that I think that the emotion should be with the people who are having the experience and not with the journalist. I really don't think that my emotions are important. And with somebody like Charles Wheeler, he's not overdoing it, he's not ladling it on, but he's showing you these people and how they're suffering. And then he stands there and explains what it's like, so you feel it. But he doesn't do what I call the full Fergal. Fergal Keane has a style which works for him and which is good. And lots of reporters emulate it, and they are crap. Because they're not him, and they just overdo it. And it just sounds awful. And it's like they want to be the center of attention. And I really don't think that we should be the center of attention. I think that the people we're reporting on are the center of attention.
Interesting. Okay. So an extraordinary thing happened to you, which was you ended up being the only English-speaking correspondent in Rwanda when the genocide began. Is that right? How on earth did that happen?
Well, my career really did hit rock bottom. I mean, I was, you know, I didn't know what to do. And so I went back to the old contacts, to UNICEF, and they said, oh, well, come to Rwanda for a couple of months, and you can do some work writing newsletters and helping NGOs understand the political situation. So I thought, oh, fine, I thought, I'll go. And I'd been in Burundi, I hadn't been in Rwanda, and I thought, oh, maybe I'll write a book on Burundi or something. Anyway, it seemed like a good idea at the time. So off I went, which on the 7th of February, 1994. And I figured out pretty early on that this was a very, very horrible place, and horrible things were going on. And I learned a lot in those 2 months about Hutus and Tutsis and tensions and so on. And then April the 7th, which was in fact the day my contract with UNICEF was up, the plane carrying the presidents of Rwanda and Burundi was shot down and the genocide started. And I was there. And it was a small, obscure country that nobody cared about. There were a couple of Belgian reporters there. The Belgians couldn't leave their homes because it was dangerous and Belgians were being killed. On day 2, 11 Belgian peacekeepers were murdered. So I was it. So I just started to report as best I could. And
for anyone and everyone.
For anyone and everybody. Anybody. I was living in the Oxfam house. I was sharing a house with somebody from Oxfam who wasn't there. And so the phone line was open. I just, and to begin with, the first few days I didn't go out much, but I had a lot of information, and because I had a lot of acquaintances and people I knew in UNICEF, and they just kept ringing me and telling me what was happening, and it was heartbreaking because it was, I mean, they were ringing me and asking me to write down their last words. They were saying, Lindsey, the Interahamwe, that's the machete-wielding gangs of Hutu extremists, they said, they're outside my house, they're coming for us. They're here. And so this is how I knew what was going on. And then on day 4, I called Philippe Gaillard of the Red Cross, and he said, come out with us. And so I got in my car, and it wasn't very far to the Red Cross, but I was absolutely terrified. And the reason I was terrified was because I had no sense of direction. And I just thought it would just be absolutely typical of you to take a wrong turning and get killed because you were lost. And Kigali is the smallest city in the world. I mean, nobody gets lost in Kigali. It's not possible, but I knew that I was capable of getting lost in Kigali. Anyway, I didn't, luckily. So I drove out, and there was a roadblock full of these drunken militiamen with broken bottles, and they had these horrible, like, sticks with a round end studded with nails, and the people who they were killing at the side of the road. And I just drove through. I just smiled and waved, and I drove through, and I got to the Red Cross, and then the Red Cross took me out with them. And so I'm not going to talk about it. I saw the most appalling things. But it meant that I found out what was going on. And then I rang the UN. I had been avoiding ringing the UN because I thought the UN security people would try and make me leave the country, which I wasn't going to do. So I just didn't call them. And then eventually it got to the point where I thought, I really do have to call them. So there was a French security official, we always used to call him Moustache, because he had a moustache. And he and I had had terrible arguments in the past because he did not believe that there should be women in the French police force. And so we had the most appalling rows on this subject before, but eventually I had to ring him and say, I think I need your help. And he said, where the hell have you been? I need you to come around and witness what's going on. So Moustache put me in the back of his vehicle, and he was trying to rescue UN staff. And he just took me around so I could see everything that was going on. I should say that at the end of all that, he said to me, you know, Lindsey, you are braver than a lot of the men I've seen here. And I said, and what do you think about women in the French police force? He said, no, no. Pas possible, pas possible.
So how long were you there?
How long was I there?
Yeah.
Not very long initially. I was there for about 10 days, and then I left, and then I went to Burundi, and I came back up through the south. And then I was there for, oh God, on and off for about 3 years. But I mean, the initial, I left when the other journalists came in, which was something I will regret all my life. I shouldn't have left, but I did.
So who was your main outlet during that first 10 days?
Guardian, BBC, observer. Can't remember everybody.
Okay. Let's introduce your next piece, which is from Rwanda, and it's something.
Yeah, let me explain about this. This is a bit later on. I'd gone back later in the year, and this was a piece I did for Woman's Hour, so it's radio. I had gone to, and it was when we had just begun to understand about the incidence of rape and how much rape there had been during the genocide. And also it was about, I came across this clinic, I went to this clinic with this Ugandan doctor called Dr. Donna Kabatese, and there was a nurse called Mary Goretti, and she was a Tutsi, and I realized that not only was she the only Tutsi in the area, and she was the nurse, but that her family had been killed, and she had had 5 children, and one of her sons, a diabetic, she had had to leave to die to save the others, to get the others out. And she was the nurse working to save the families of the people who had killed her family. And this was, which is just sort of unthinkable, and this was something, so this is a bit from the middle of the piece about how it was for her as the only Tutsi working amongst the Hutus who had killed her children.
While Mary Goretti is Tutsi, the people she nurses are mainly Hutu. Some of her patients may be killers, maybe even the killers of her family. I asked how could she bear to carry on working here.
She says she has had difficulties trying to work in maternity delivery rooms because here she feels that in delivery rooms you are faced with life and death, and kind of keeps on reminding her of all the deaths and all the suffering. But the other thing, of course, she feels bad that if a woman loses a baby during delivery, they may blame her. They may say that it's because she's angry with them, she didn't take a lot of care. So she tries to avoid working in delivery rooms, but she treats patients, ordinary patients, with no problems.
This stoicism, according to Dr. Donna Kabatese, is ingrained in Rwandan culture.
Rwandan women traditionally are either trained or brought up not to express what they are feeling unless it is extremely unbearable. To illustrate this, when women are going through labor pains, Rwandan women are going through labor pains, they're not supposed to cry or shout in pain. And I think this is something, again, that is happening to them. What you see with these women here is really an emptiness which you can't explain, a blank stare which you can't interpret as pain or stress. So I think this is partly trying to hide what they are feeling underneath.
I still find that quite hard.
Yeah.
I mean, mostly, I don't think it makes any difference whether you're a man or a woman, but I don't think a man would have got those answers. I really don't. I think it would have been quite hard. And I think that, and it was also, I suppose it's an example of you ask a question and you really don't know what the answer is going to be. I have no idea that the answer would be that, you know, it was hard to be confronted with life and death, and that she feared that they would blame her if any of them lost a child. I mean, it just would never have occurred to me that that was how they felt. But so that I just think that section just tells you so much about Rwandan women and what it's like to be a Rwandan woman.
It's interesting how powerful radio is.
Yes.
Well, isn't it? Do you miss doing radio?
I do, actually. I really do miss radio. I love that sort of stuff where you can really get... I mean, television, you can also get people to speak for themselves in the same way. I mean, like all people who've worked for the BBC, I miss writing from our own correspondent, because that's, you know, that's when you can just say what you really enjoy saying, and, you know, all the other bits that you couldn't fit in the main news story. But yeah, and sort of outlets like Woman's Hour and so on, where you just get all those textural things that are hard to squash into the news.
Do you have any particular personal techniques for interviewing people? I mean, clearly there are different kinds of interviews. Do you have any personal craft techniques?
One thing I do is at the end of an interview, I do nearly always say, is there anything you want to say to me? And quite often that does end up being the answer that you use. And that's because you've asked all the wrong questions all the way along. So that one I find works. And sometimes I think it works, and I don't always manage to do it, to be a bit silent, to not always interrupt. I'm much more of a sort of letting people speak. But one of the difficulties is in much of the time I'm working in translation. And so, you know, a lot of the techniques that you might have don't work quite the same, and you're very reliant on your local producer or fixer, who's speaking, one of whom is here, speaking the language. So you have to rather rely on them to pull out what it is you want to pull out. And obviously your techniques are different, you know, depending on who it is. I mean, if it's an evil, lying bastard politician, then it's rather different from if it's a victim of genocide, isn't it?
Okay. So you went on to do win an Amnesty Award, I think, for another Rwanda piece. This was a
documentary about the church, about the complicity of the church in the genocide. Yeah. Yeah.
Okay. And then a massive break for you, in a sense, in career terms, which was that you joined Channel 4 as diplomatic correspondent.
I did, yes. Yeah.
And was that a job you applied for?
Yeah, I was in Rwanda, and a friend rang me up and said, this job is going. I'd been to see Channel 4, and they'd said, yeah. And that never heard from them again. And so I wrote, again, post, you know. Yes, sir, I would like to apply for this job. And I got a postcard back to the Lindsey Hilsum, Hotel Diplomat, Kigali, Rwanda. Thank you for your application. And I thought, yeah. And then eventually, you know, it was very difficult. I would like disappear to southern Rwanda for, you know, a week and a half with no telephones. There were no telephones. And eventually I realized, you know, calls did come and messages left for me at the Hotel Diplomats. And I realized that actually they did really want to interview me, so maybe I ought to go home. So I did. And I got the job. And I was and they took a chance on me because I was not qualified for it. Not really.
Why?
Well, because...
all that reporting you'd done?
Yeah, all that reporting I'd done, but as diplomatic correspondent. And, you know, I'd never been to Russia. Well, I'd been to Azerbaijan. You know, and I'd not, you know, all the sort of classic stuff of diplomacy, I had not covered it at all. So I spun a line about how diplomacy had changed, and it was no longer east-west, it was all north-south, because that was where all my experience was. And they believed me.
Everybody else said east-west.
Yeah.
Okay, should we have a look at your next piece, Lindsey, which is some way into you being...
oh, right, this is Jenin.
Yeah, do you want to say a little bit about the story and the circumstances?
Yeah, this is a piece I did with Tim Lambont, who is there, you know, at the back, who's the cameraman and producer. This was when the Israelis were besieging the refugee camp of Jenin. And when I looked at what to include in my own stories, of course it's very difficult because there's so many stories that mean a lot to you, you know, Zimbabwe, Kosovo, you know, Belgrade, Iraq, you know, so much. And one of the reasons I chose this one was because it's an example of a story which was done in a tearing hurry, which is often how it is. You know, we drove for 8 hours through olive groves, off-road, to get to Jenin. The Israelis were keeping everyone out. We had to run in full flak jackets and helmets up into the camp. When I say camp, you know, it's a sort of stone town on top of each other. I had to climb up a wall, or rather, somebody had to push me up a wall. I had to jump off the other side of the wall. Somebody had to catch me. And then, you know, Tim suddenly turns and says, right, do a piece to camera. I think, oh. I have no idea what to say at this point. And we're seeing this incredible destruction and a few bodies lying around, and yet I have no time to be considered. And then I thought back to a friend of mine who is a documentary producer. When I had first done television and I was confused about what to do about piece to camera, I said, what do I do? And he said, well, just say what strikes you most. So that's the point in the piece where you look at the audience and you say, this is what it's about. This is it. This is the story. This is what matters. And so I just kind of looked around me and said what struck me most. And so that's part of the piece from Jenin.
We
We saw just 2 bodies. It seems this person was incinerated when the house was burnt. No telling if it was a man or a woman, a combatant or a civilian.
No,
This one seems to have been buried in the rubble of his house as it was demolished and then caught fire.
Imagine what this was like when the battle was going on. The Israeli army came in tanks, armoured personnel carriers, bulldozers, and inside all these buildings there were snipers shooting at the soldiers. And the ordinary people, the civilians, screaming inside as their houses were bulldozed, collapsed into rubble around them.
Who knows how many bodies lie beneath the rubble? From time to time I could smell death, but I couldn't see it. The army said it would remove dead combatants to bury in unmarked graves and return civilians to their families. But a court injunction has stopped that. The Palestinians say Israel wants to cover up a massacre. Israel says about 100 Palestinians died here. People told me the soldiers took away the wounded. They don't know where.
Go.
It wasn't possible to talk to people at length. We could hear the roar of Israeli patrols in their armoured vehicles. Everyone said, keep moving or you'll be caught. This woman just said she had no food and had almost run out of water. The Battle of Jenin has already turned into a myth. For Palestinians, it was a massacre of innocents. For Israelis, proof that they had to defeat terrorists, suicide bombers. 22 Israeli soldiers were killed in ambushes and booby-trapped buildings here. There's no doubt it was a militant stronghold. How will these people rebuild the homes Israeli soldiers destroyed? It was called a camp, but refugees had lived here so long it had become a small town. Now it's a ruin, full of Palestinians who've once again lost their possessions, their homes, their livelihoods, and members of their families. They're left only with anger and hatred for Israel.
I mean, the other thing about that is, which was important at the time, was that we were the first in. We were there, I think, 2 days ahead of anybody else, so that was important at the time. And the other thing, which is just a story about it, was that so we had to run to get that. We were just running the whole time, and then we had to get the story out, right? So there we are. So Tim, now this is a very important technique, hid the tape in his sock. And then we had to drive out through various Israeli roadblocks. Well, us, Jenin, what? Yeah. So, and then we got to where we could edit, and then it looked for a moment as if it was going to be impossible to edit because the tape was so sweaty from his foot, and it kept sticking. But we had, how long did we have? An hour to edit? 45 minutes? Something like that. It was just banged together. It was absolutely banged together. And I don't think I've ever been so tired in my whole life as I was after that.
Actually enough, Lindsey has omitted to mention that she won an RTS award for that.
Yeah, we won an RTS.
I mean, it does. I mean, talking about Tim, it does require fantastic teamwork to get these things done. And I mean, what is your kind of modus operandi with your team, as it were?
I have to be very careful what I say because there's 3 people there.
Perhaps I should ask them. Actually.
Perhaps you should. No, you have some later. Yeah. Okay, there was quite a long time when Tim and I worked together, just the 2 of us. We did Belgrade and Kosovo. Quite a lot of that was just the 2 of us. The Iraq War, we had a producer, Arabic-speaking producer, Paul Edel. And so we did a lot of stuff together, and we worked very well as a team. And Tim has military experience, and probably one of the reasons why I dared to do some things was because I was with him, which I might not have dared to do with other people. You know, I like small teams, 2 people, 3 people. I don't like big teams. And, you know, like most correspondents, I rely on a producer like Sarah over there to keep me in order and stop me from losing my temper and all the other bad things.
What about safety issues?
Safety issues.
Do you consider yourself to be the sort of primus inter pares, as it were? When it
depends who. I mean, if I'm honest, when I'm working with Tim, because he's got the military background, we sort of do what he says, because I trust him completely to understand that stuff. And that has meant that I will be braver in those situations than I will be in other situations, and I don't feel responsible for him in the same way. But with other people, I do feel responsible, and I do feel primus inter pares, and therefore I feel I have to be more careful. And I wonder if I've become more careful in my old age and am going a bit soft sometimes. And I do worry about it in a way that you don't when you're younger.
Yeah. Okay, I want to leave time at the end for questions. So can we move on to the next piece?
Yeah, the next piece is I was in China for 2 years.
You've got a poem, I think.
Oh, a poem, sorry, before China. Oh yes.
Have you got that?
Oh, yes, that's right. Well, this is because journalism really doesn't... it's fine, right? Journalism is fine. It tells you some things about what are going on in the world and helps you understand them. But in the end, only poetry really reaches what it's all about. And I usually travel with a book of James Fenton's poetry, because James was, he was a correspondent in Cambodia and in the Philippines as well. But eventually he realized this was true, and he wrote poetry instead of articles. And I was going to read one called Jerusalem, but it's too long. But Jerusalem is a great poem which I would highly recommend to you, because when journalists, we always ask the same questions and we get the same answers in the Middle East. It's, we go round and round in circles. And in that poem, he breaks through it. And then similarly in Africa with refugee situations, you end up with cliche if you're not careful. And James's poem, Wind, it's about refugees in Africa. And it's kind of every story I've ever done in those situations. This is the wind in a field of corn. Great crowds are fleeing from a major disaster, down the long valleys, the green swaying wadis, down through the beautiful catastrophe of wind. Families, tribes, nations and their livestock have heard something, seen something. An expectation or misunderstanding has swept over the hilltop, bending the ear of the hedgerow with stories of fire and sword. I saw 1,000 years pass in 2 seconds. Land was lost. Languages rose and divided. This lord went east and found safety. His brother sought Africa in a dish of aloes. Centuries, minutes later, one might ask, how the hilt of a sword wandered so far from the smithy. And somewhere they will sing, like chaff we were born in the wind. This is the wind in a field of corn. I think that says more about being a refugee in Africa and what happens and movements of people than we ever manage to do. 1,000 years passes in 2 seconds. That's what it's like.
It's funny, actually, when Alan was here before, he said you've got to read poetry to be able to write really well.
Yes.
Do you write poetry?
Nah. I just write scripts.
Well, they are poetry sometimes.
Not mine.
Okay, we'll just move on to your last piece, but from 2003 onwards, you went through this extraordinarily intense period with Channel 4, Baghdad. Did you stay during the...
We were in Baghdad we arrived on February the 6th, and then the build up to the war and through the 3 weeks of war, and then for about 10 days after the war. So that was like 3 months in Baghdad throughout the war, and then we went back sort of several times a year after that for a few years.
Beslan, Africa, Iran, and then in the middle of all this, you were appointed international editor. How would you distinguish between diplomatic correspondent and international editor? One's a
more money, more status.
More refined, yeah. Good. And then a whole string of awards along the way. RTS, you won an Emmy Award.
That was for the whole team for Iraq.
Yeah, James Cameron Award. And then some others like Amnesty, One World, and so on. So truly extraordinary range of awards. And then you ended up, at the end of all that, deciding to go to China. Why was that?
Well, Tim came off the road and started to do a different job. I felt, Beslan was actually really, really, really hard. Beslan was awful. and there was something happened, I think, standing in a muddy field where 300 families are burying their children. I found it really tough. And also I just felt that, partly the poetry is relevant because I thought if I'm going to carry on doing these same kind of stories, I can't keep on doing it in television. I have to find a different way of expressing this because I can't just keep, I've come to the end, I felt at that point, of how much I can say in a television script. So I had to either change my medium and do something different, or I had to change my location. And so the job of China correspondent came up, and for me that was perfect because I knew nothing about China. That was my major qualification. So I had everything to learn, and I wasn't ever going to be bored with it or feel that I'd done it before in television, because I hadn't done it at all. It was completely new. And so I went and said to my editor, I really want to go to China, and I was very lucky that he agreed that I could go. And China was brilliant because China, it's, there's no herd mentality amongst journalists in China. You're not on the main story that everyone is on, and you're not kind of, knocking, Jeremy coming onto the, satellite feed straight after Jeremy Bowen or whatever, and everybody is sort of there doing the same stories. You can really do original stories and do your own thing. Because there's a less of a news agenda there. So we did lots of investigative reports, and really I managed to I got to Tibet, I got to Xinjiang, and I also, because China is so important in the world now, I also really feel that I began to see the world in a different way, and that, again, you talk about Africa, you can't just look at the way Africa is from our perspective here in the West. China is the biggest investor in Africa now. This is really important. This is the way the world is changing. China is China is changing the world, and if you don't understand anything about China, you can't really understand what's happening in the world. And that was really important to me to try and get a grasp of that.
Yeah, I was at the BBC at the time when you went there. It was an incredible statement, it seemed, from outside Channel 4 that Channel 4 were making by sending you to China. Actually, was it a difficult place to work?
It is difficult in the sense that you have to be very quick because the instinct in China is, no, you can't do it. So you have to have your ducks in a row. If you're going to, for example, if you're doing a story about, so you're doing a story about people protesting because their houses have been knocked down to put up some other factory or whatever, which is a very sort of typical story in China. I was lucky because I had a wonderful Chinese-American producer called Bessie Du, who would get everything sorted in advance, because when you get there, you've probably got 20 minutes or half an hour before some bloody busybody tells the local authorities that the Lao Wai, old foreign person, is in town, is there, and you better stop them. So you've just got to do it. Land, film, do your interviews, get out. So that's, but if you follow those principles, you can do a lot, and I think we managed to do quite a lot of stuff there.
Okay, should we look at your piece?
Yeah, but the piece I've chosen, because a lot of this stuff is also miserable and grim, so I've chosen a piece for the M, which I think is very funny. And it's because humour, part of what we do is obviously trying to point up the cruelty and absurdity of governments. And there is no government more cruel and absurd than the Chinese Communist Party. And this story, which was during the Olympics, everything in China was supposed to be seen as wonderful. And you may remember that there was a lot of fuss about people can't protest in China. So they opened protest parks, and Chinese people could apply for permission to protest. 76 people applied for permission to protest. Unfortunately, 76 were turned down for various reasons. Amongst those turned down were Mrs. Wang and Mrs. Wu. And Mrs. Wang and Mrs. Wu, who you're about to see, were, I think, 79 and 80 years old. Their house had been knocked down. They were unhappy with their compensation, and they had thought that the protest parks were a jolly good idea. And so they had been sentenced to re-education through labour.
I've met unlikely rebels, but none quite like 79-year-old Mrs. Wu and her 77-year-old neighbour Mrs. Wang, who the Chinese government says have been disturbing public order by trying to protest about their compensation claim.
At first they said we'd be detained for 10 days. They didn't do it, but we had to stand by for detention any time. If they didn't call us, we could wait at home.
The police detained them for 10 hours. Hard for Mrs. Wang, who has no teeth.
They gave us stir-fried cucumber. She couldn't chew it, so I had to eat it instead.
Their good humour and determination are undiminished, even though the authorities cut off electricity to the single rooms they were allocated when their homes were demolished 7 years ago. They were delighted when they heard about the Olympic protest parks, until they were served with this document. It says,
according to the trial regulations of the re-education through Labour Article 10, items 3, 5 and 14, we hereby decide to send her to Labour camp for 1 year. We have confiscated the criminal tools.
That may be a reference to the fireworks they tried to let off as a protest. They've been told they can serve their sentence at home, where there are plenty of spies, who get short shrift from Mrs. Wu.
Come in and talk to us then. Stop peeping. How annoying. You come and help me remember what happened.
The spies were a little camera shy. It gives a whole new meaning to the concept of neighborhood watch.
You can't be afraid. If you are, they come to bully you.
Fantastic. Absolutely brilliant.
I love Mrs. Wang and Mrs. Wu. But I just think, I mean, it's just an example of a story. I mean, it's so absurd and it's funny, but it does tell you something about how the Chinese government operates, and certainly how the local government operates, that they would think that that was a reasonable thing to do to try and stop there being any disturbance during China's party during the Olympics.
Okay. I'm going to pause there for a moment and ask for questions from the floor, please. But can I just, the one rule is, can you just wait? This is being sent out on the internet, so if you could wait for the microphone before you ask the question, that would be great. So, please, questions? Somebody. Good.
Just would like to know, how do you cope with your own emotions? That must be...
My own emotions?
Yeah.
Well, okay, various things. First of all, I really love my job, so I'm happy a lot of the time. Right. Secondly, I believe it's important to tell people what's going on in the world, and so I'm quite highly motivated, so that helps. And sometimes I get upset, and I think that's completely reasonable. I mean, I think that if you don't get upset about something like Beslan or Rwanda, then there's something wrong with you. And I do get upset, and I can still, if I think about Rwanda a lot, I cry. And it's 15 years ago, or however many years ago it is now. But I think that's all right. I mean, it doesn't stop me functioning. It just means that I've seen some horrible things, and sometimes they upset me. But, there you go. I don't ever, but I feel that that's very separate from my reporting. I mean, I think that I think it's good to be a human being as well as a reporter, but I don't believe in letting my emotions show on camera. I don't think that's helpful to anybody, but I'm reasonably comfortable about them in myself.
You mentioned earlier that Kate Adie had a way of speaking to the audience. How do you change the way you report for different audiences? For example, you do Women's Hour and BBC, Channel 4, and probably some Canadian and French. And
that's a very good question. I'm not sure that I really do. Maybe that's a weakness. I mean, recently all I've done is Channel 4 News, although I did have a column in the New Statesman for a while. And I sometimes think that the way I should change is to be a bit clearer and simpler. I think that sometimes I can be too complex in the way I try and express or explain things, because I am aware of so much complexity, and I hate the sort of oversimplified stuff. But I think that one of the things with Channel 4 News, because we have a longer time slot, you can be a little bit more discursive or put in more explanation and so on than I was able to do when I was doing news pieces for the BBC.
Can you make more assumptions because of the audience?
Well, I think we do, and that's probably a mistake.
Yeah.
I think I do make assumptions, and I think that that's a mistake because I think that actually you can't provide too much context and explanation. People are very busy in their lives. They've got a million things going on, and expecting them to remember the history of Iran or whatever, it's not going to happen. So I think that quite often we should, if you have a choice with length for another bit of information about what happened today or a bit of context to help people understand what you've reported so far, that you should probably opt for the bit of context, usually.
Considering research has shown that young people multitask, what or where do you think the future of journalism is?
Down the toilet. I don't know. I don't know where it is. I think that there is certainly an issue about attention span. There's people have a shorter and shorter attention span, and the kind of work that I do does require a certain attention span. 3, 4, 5, 10, 15 minutes attention span. So I think that is very difficult. But I think that there will always be a market for quality journalism, which is what I hope we do at Channel 4 News. But the market may be smaller, and people may have to pay more for it. And the other issue is that the market out there internationally is huge. Just as people here are getting bored and not wanting to be not interested in news or more interested in celebrity news and so on. There's all these countries in Eastern Europe or in Africa or in the Far East and so on where lots of young people are incredibly interested in news.
What is you mentioned Channel 4 being quality operation, which obviously it is, but what makes Channel 4 distinct? The length or what? What is it trying to do differently from everybody else? Well,
I think there's sort of endless sort of agonizing discussions about this in Channel 4 News all the time, as you can imagine. It's partly the length, but I think that it's also that we will come at things at a slightly different angle, and we will present things in a different way. One example which I would always give of something which we were able to do, which the BBC would never have let me do, which was we were in Rafah refugee camp in Gaza. And the Israelis had come in and demolished a whole bunch of homes with bulldozers overnight. And Chris McGreal of The Guardian passed me. Tim and I were filming, and Chris McGreal passed me and said, the Israelis are saying that they haven't bulldozed any homes in Rafah. And so I said, I better ring the Israeli Defense Force. And Tim said, why don't you stand on that pile of rubble and ring the Israeli Defense Force, and I'll wire up the phone conversation. Okay, that's a good idea. So I rang the Israeli Defense Force and I said, hello, can you tell me, did you destroy any houses in Rafah last night? And they said, no. I said, you didn't destroy any houses? They said, no, no houses. I said, so how come I'm standing on a pile of rubble? What? I said, so how come I'm standing on a pile of rubble then? Yeah, and then over the day the message changed. Then they said, the Palestinians destroyed their own houses. They blew them up, and then by the end of the day they were saying, well, yes, actually we did destroy some houses with bulldozers last night. And I thought that way of telling the story, the BBC would never in 100 million years have let me do that, would they? Stand on a pile of rubble and, but Channel 4 News let me do that because they'll let you just come at it in a slightly ruder way. Because they would not see it as straight and impartial reporting. I think that they would think it was too cheeky. Am I wrong?
I think in a news bulletin, Newsnight might entertain me.
Yeah, Newsnight would have done it. Yeah, Newsnight could have done it. That's right. Newsnight could have done it, but the 10 o'clock news would never have done it. Yeah.
Yeah.
Hold on.
Okay, sorry.
Yeah. Go on.
I've got lots of questions, but I'm trying to boil it down to one. Given that you were slightly emotional, if you don't mind me saying so, about John Pilger, do you think there's any place for idealism in foreign correspondent reporting?
Idealism?
Yes, because let's face it, objectivity is a rather scientific ideal, isn't it?
Yes, I think there's lots of room for idealism and passion, but I don't think there's room for having a political view that blinds you to the things which interfere with that political view, with other things that are going on. I think that if you're a good foreign correspondent, you should be open to finding out that you're wrong. I've been wrong so many times, and but that doesn't, which in a sense is a kind of idealism in itself. You know, I'm quite idealistic about journalism and how one should try and do it honestly and truthfully. Does that answer the question?
It does, but I've had a conversation. I've interviewed you on the phone about emotion a couple of years ago.
Oh, did you? Was I very emotional?
It's my doctorate.
Oh, is it? Oh, shit.
And I've interviewed John Pilger as well on the phone.
Oh, yes.
And what's interesting is that he also likes Martha Gellhorn for the exact reason that you don't like her. Sorry, for the opposite reason.
For the opposite reason, yeah.
That's what I'm trying to say. That you can tell why I'm not a journalist. And that is that he thinks, well, obviously it came up in the discussion already, or your presentation already, that she is very, you described her as left-wing. She's against objectivity. Yes. And it does strike me as slightly interesting that people who have very strong views about what's polemical and what's objective should have an ideal that's almost the same ideal, or that's just the complexity.
Well, you know what Walt Whitman said, don't you?
I don't.
He said, so I contradict myself, I contain multitudes.
But you don't when you're
reporting. No. No, I do contain multitudes, but I don't contradict myself when reporting. Yes?
I'm just quite interested in how your own political standing from the start of your career to now, how that's evolved. And did you start out in one stance? And where have you evolved to? I'm not necessarily asking where you are personally, but how has that evolved? And what has had the major impact on that evolution?
Well, I think I started out, or when I went to Latin America, I was very sure that I knew what was right and what was wrong politically. And then it turned out that I was not necessarily entirely right. And, you know, romantic revolutionary heroes, you know, Daniel Ortega, I mean, now the most revolting dictator in Nicaragua who denies 14-year-olds who've been raped the right to have an abortion. I mean, really. You know, and yet at one point, of course, I thought that he was marvelous. So, you know, I would say that that's what I mean about reality interfering. And I learned that simple political solutions, you know, Robin Hood, rob the rich to give to the poor. I saw people trying to do that and it not working and making everything worse. Yes. I think that that's an inevitable part of the kind of work that we do. I have certainly become much more skeptical. I've probably become cynical, and yes, on the whole, I think that it doesn't work out. So yes, definitely, I have lost faith. Will you leave now? But that doesn't mean I ought. But I still, you see, I say that, but I still do believe in things, and I certainly do believe in, you know, in trying to do what's right, and I believe in understanding and trying to understand things, and it's important to try and understand what's going on, because if you don't understand anything, then you've no hope of ever trying to make it better. And so I suppose what I believe now is that what I can do is try and understand things myself and help people understand, other people understand them, and then hope that better decisions get made. But I am glad that I'm a journalist, not a politician. I'd probably be a horrible ditherer as a politician.
All right. Drawing in 2 points, on 2 points you mentioned that in the Middle East everybody reports the same story, and we in the Middle East call it a fashionable story at a certain time, and then it falls out, and there's tons of other stories that are not reported. Where do you stand on parachute journalism in that sense?
Sorry, on which kind of journalism?
And on parachute journalism.
Parachute journalism.
And it's also if drawing from that question, is you just said I always try to know what's happening and inform people. What is your source for information then? Is it local people? Is it the wires? Like tons of country you're reporting on. Where do you get all the information
from? Yeah, I would say parachute journalism. I think two things. On the one hand, I understand why people don't like parachute journalism. People come in and don't know what they're talking about. On the other hand, I remember an occasion in Sudan. I was in Sudan in the late 80s during floods, and there was a young British journalist came out, and I'd been living in East Africa for some time by then, and she really didn't know what she was doing. She was sort of hopeless, and we all felt very sorry for her, and so on, because she was so awful, and she had no background and no understanding. Her piece was so much better than any of the rest of our pieces, because she saw things that we no longer saw. She was still shocked by seeing children living on rubbish dumps. We didn't even notice the children on the rubbish dumps because we'd seen them so many times. So sometimes your parachute journalism is really good, because you see things that people have, the old hacks have stopped seeing. And on sources, of course, one tries to have as many sources as possible. And yes, you use the wires. And yes, you're often very reliant on your local fixer, so quite often too reliant. And yes, you try and talk to government people. And yes, you try and talk to everybody you meet. You just get as many sources as you can. And in a lot of places, I'm going back. So I've been there before, so I'm building on contacts who I've made in the past, or who, you know, the producer knows, or whatever. So you do build it. You're not... If you're parachuting, and I accept the idea that I'm parachuting, I'm quite often parachuting into a place where I've parachuted before. So,
on China,
yes.
Given three of the things that you mentioned, two of them problems, one opportunity. Firstly, the state of the market here. Secondly, the problems reporting there, but then also the opportunity, the fact that there's no herdism, as you said. What advice would you have for anybody quite keen and getting ready to go there and freelance?
Be young, because then you have a much better chance of learning Chinese than I did, because it's really, really hard to try and learn Chinese at the age I tried to learn it. Expect to find it hard, just to get stories out, because there's actually less interest in China now than there was. I mean, the 2 years leading up to the Olympics was great. There was lots of appetite for stories, and all of the journalists out there, we got lots of stuff on. Since I left, I mean, we have a correspondent who's covering China. He's not based in China now. But there's really very little appetite, because everybody did so much before the Olympics. It's like we all the outlets exhausted themselves with it. And the other advice, I don't know, just go for it. If you want to go, go. Just go. Try. Why not? Saeed.
I just want to ask you, if a British paper wants to hire a correspondent in year one, for example. Do you think they should send a British correspondent there, or they should hire an Iranian correspondent there?
Well, Saeed, I think that the best combination is the Iranian and the foreigner. And I think they should work together. That's what I think. I think that sometimes it depends. I think that you get insights and understanding from a national of the country that a foreigner will never get. But sometimes the national of the country, again, takes things for granted and doesn't find things surprising or worth reporting that somebody from outside and the audience doesn't know about. And therefore you need to, and also the outsider, sometimes, you know, there's a house style and so on. So the best, I would say, is a combination of the two.
Similar to the parachute argument in a way. Yeah.
I've got 2 points. The first is what you were saying about Kate Adie earlier. About 3 years ago, my friend Annie and I came to see a talk you gave here. Okay. And I asked you then, what would you do?
Oh, and I said something different.
An aspiring foreign correspondent. And you said, I just get out there and get on with it. So I went to Mexico, she went to Argentina, and we both did very well. She's up for the Amnesty Award this year, and I just came back to take a job with the FT in the video department. So
there you are. Brilliant.
It was good advice.
Exciting.
I think one of the things that I saw, I was out in Mexico working for the LA Times, and of all the sort of hemorrhaging that the media industry took, that the foreign bureaus seem to have been some of the hardest hit. I saw a talk Robert Fisk gave recently, and he was very disparaging about the web and its contribution to society. And when I was in Mexico, my big thing was I had this website and I filed in video and audio and words, and there was work, you know, and it was kind of a new model.
Yeah.
So what's your view on the future, especially of foreign bureaus, foreign news, foreign reporters, and what sort of new technologies have to contribute to that?
Right. Well, first of all, I'm thrilled that you and your friend did so well. That's really exciting. I think that the web is the way it's going. I think that, I don't know within how many years, the difference between our television and our computer, there won't be a difference anymore. I think it's quite hard for people like me to understand this and see this. But I think that's the way it's going. I think it's futile to be against the web or whatever. I mean, what is the point? It's, you know, that's the way it's going. That's what's happening. I think that the problem is that increasingly people who want to go into journalism are going to end up processing information that is fed in from news agencies. And so there's going to be fewer and fewer jobs in journalism which are actually out there doing it, and more which are turning it around. And I think that people who do what you've done and what I did are going to have to do it under their own steam, which is what I did in the beginning, but then I was lucky enough to find the safe berth I eventually got. And I think that the problem is that for people like you, you know, it may be more difficult to find, you know, to finally get to the place where they'll pay you to do it instead of having to desperately pull together whatever money you can. But in the sense, it's, in terms of the information and finding stuff out and so on, it's up to all of us just to keep doing it. Isn't it?
I mean, one of the reasons I came back to work for the FT is the hope that they'll eventually create a video bureau outside. And the FT is one of the few newspapers that still has a very big foreign network. Do you think those jobs will still exist in sort of 10 years' time? You know, existing media brands having... I've no idea, but I'm sure you were right to come back and work for something as good as the FT. Yeah.
I think the paradox to a certain extent is that as staff jobs diminish abroad, there are more opportunities for people to go as stringers. It's just they won't be on staff.
Yes. There'll be less protection and less money. Yeah.
Okay, one last question. Yeah.
Ask, what more have you got to give? And how long more
Absolutely
are you
nothing until I have another drink. So go on.
Just that's it. What more have you got to go? How long are you going to be with Channel 4? What are your future plans?
Okay, no, that's a sort of desperately important and worrying question. We've got less money for foreign reporting at the moment. That's a worry. It's the same for everybody. I have, in the last year or so, I was in Iran, and that's the thing which really interests me. And even though I'm not allowed to go to Iran at the moment because I'm banned until I apologize for my last story, I was told. And so, but I'm trying to follow it anyway through refugees and people who come out and so on. There are still ways of following what's going on in Iran. And then the other thing which I've become very interested in is stuff about, I touched on it with China, which is about how the world works. I did 2 stories last year, which were not the kind of stories I would ever have done before. One was about lithium in Bolivia and how Bolivia is the Saudi Arabia of lithium. Lithium is needed for electric cars. And all this untapped lithium is in Bolivia. And this, to me, is sort of fascinating. There's sort of a country with a very left-wing government that doesn't want the multinationals to come in and just exploit it, but is trying to find a new model for a way that they can make money out of it, but not quite knowing how to do it. So that was very interesting. I did a story about rare earths in China. Rare earths, remember your periodic table. Rare earths like neodymium and so on. They're all essential for all the environmentally friendly technologies like wind turbines and those light bulbs that mean that you can't read properly, and all of those important technologies. And 96% of the world's rare earths are mined in China. So the world, we're always saying we want to produce all these new technologies. We're totally dependent on China for it, and they are produced at the expense of farmers in Inner Mongolia, whose land is being ruined by the terrible environmental practices of the people mining rare earth in China. So those kind of things I find really interesting now, and they're actually not sort of frontline stories, and they're not stories you win awards for, and they're not stories which have you out there in your flak jacket. But in terms of trying to understand how the world works and what's moving and changing in the world, I find those stories really interesting at the moment. So those are some of the things that I'm... Yep, they have gone with them. They went with those stories last year. This year's been a bit quieter, but this year isn't over yet.
I think that is what can make it distinctive as well. Actually.
Yeah.
Okay, Lindsey, you've been a fantastic guest, and if I might say so, the most amazing role model, actually, for all journalists. I'd like to thank David Hayward and the team from the college, Julie and the team from the Frontline Club, you for your questions, but most of all, Lindsey Hilsum.
Thank you.